616 Squadron, changing of the guard. On June the 12th, 1945, a new and deadly aerial threat appeared in the skies over southern England. Fast, sleek, and powered by a pulse jet, it was the world's first cruise missile, the V-1 flying bomb. In response, the RAF rushed into service its most advanced and secret weapon, the Gloster Meteor Mark I.
This happened in 1941. I was ferrying a Wildcat from Scotland down to Croydon. I ran into extremely bad weather over Lincoln, and it was any port in a storm. I went into Cranwell. Although they were reluctant to have me, they realized the weather was bad and they let me land there. And I was astonished to find the place alive with civilians. And I thought, this is an RAF airfield. Where are all the RAF people? And there were civilians everywhere. When I got out and asked what it was all about, there was a great conspiratorial air about everybody. Nobody would tell me why these people were all there. And I was roomed up with a guy who was a very nice fellow. I became very firm friends with him. And I kept asking him what all this was about. And he wouldn't say, and as a diversion, he took me off to the cinema that evening to keep me quiet. And anyway, I transpired, I found out later, that he was the installation engineer for the jet engine on the E-28, the first ever jet aircraft in this country. But anyway, the next day dawned, and it was not a very good day. And the control tower, I was about the only visitor there, you see, with a Wildcat, with any sort of airplane, and they said, would I do a weather test? And which I did, and I noticed when I was up, it wasn't very good weather, but enough to see that there was an awful lot of activity around one particular hangar. And the hangar doors were wide open, and I flew very low when I came back to land, but was hoping to see into this hangar, but I really couldn't. But I was getting more and more intrigued with what was going on. And I did 2 or 3 of these weather tests, and eventually I said, well, you know, the ceiling was such and such, and it was flyable just, but it was fairly late in the evening by this time. While I was mooning around my Wildcat, getting it refueled, etc., all this activity in the other hangar, suddenly out of it popped an airplane with no propeller on it. And I'd never seen a jet airplane in my life, and I didn't really know anything about jet propulsion. And anyway, I watched this with great interest, and it eventually took off about 7 o'clock in the evening, and the screaming noise that it went at, and I was absolutely intrigued by it. And of course, nobody would tell me anything about it. Always they were just quiet, but there was much jubilation at the end of it when it landed. And I left probably not much wiser when I left Cranwell the next day. And it transpired, of course, this was the first flight of a British jet aircraft. And strangely enough, by turn of the wheel, I eventually was flight testing this aircraft in the jet flight at Farnborough. Let me say, well, the first impression was when flying a jet aircraft, is the first thing that strikes you as a pilot is the marvellous view you have. There's no big engine sticking out in front of you. That's the first thing. Second thing is when you get in there, the total lack of vibration, which you have so much in piston-engine aircraft. And thirdly, a lack of noise. There may be a lot of noise outside, but you're sitting ahead of the jet engine and there's virtually no noise at all. So these were the three big impressions you make. And the acceleration on this little airplane wasn't bad, but considering it was a very small engine, it had remarkable performance. And eventually the Meteor came out, I may say, not very long indeed after. It was a disappointment because I would class the Meteor 1 as a very pedestrian aircraft.
The original specification for the Meteor called for an armament of 6 20mm cannons. This was later scaled back to 4, and when the Meteor entered service, it was armed with a Hispano Mark V short-barreled cannon. During the Second World War, the Hispano 20mm cannon was the standard armament for all British-built fighters. In 1943, a new, lighter version of the cannon entered service, equipping the Tempest and the Meteor. Unfortunately, the Meteor would be plagued by constant jamming, which was caused by updrafts in the carriage case ejector slots. Long before the first Meteor prototype flew, Gloster Aircraft received an initial production order in September 1941 for 20 aircraft. The power plants for the first 20 production aircraft were Rolls-Royce W2 B23 Welland engines, each rated at 1,700 pounds of thrust. Of the 20 Mark 1s built, only 16 were delivered to the RAF. Surprisingly, the very first production Mark 1 was shipped to the United States in exchange for the lowly Bell YP-59A. The other 3 airframes were used extensively for engine testing and trials purposes. 616 South Yorkshire Squadron of the Auxiliary Air Force was selected to be the first all-jet RAF squadron. In July 1944, the squadron's mess was rife with rumours and speculation. Most pilots believed their aging Mark 9 Spitfires would be replaced with the new Mark 14s powered by the Rolls-Royce Griffon, but a few of the pilots knew differently. On July the 21st, 2 Meteor 1s were delivered. For the pilots, it must have been an awe-inspiring moment. They'd been chosen to fly the most exciting new fighter in Allied service. The squadron's first assignment was to battle the V-1 flying. The Meteor's performance at low altitude was ideally suited for the task. Piston engine fighters like the Spitfire Mark 14 and Tempest were hard-pressed to catch the V-1 at low altitudes. Their engines were geared for high-altitude performance. In contrast, the Meteor's top speed of 410 miles per hour at sea level made it the ideal V-1 interceptor. By early August 1944, 616 was equipped with 7 Meteors. While not as potent as Germany's shark-like Messerschmitt Me 262, the Meteor did achieve a world's first. On August the 4th, Flight Officer Dixie Dean brought down a V-1, but not by gunfire. With his guns jammed, he maneuvered his fighter in close and used his wingtip to nudge the V-1 off course, causing it to crash. It was the world's first jet-versus-jet encounter, and by the end of August, 616 Squadron was credited with 12 V-1s destroyed.
In April 1937, Air Commodore Sir Frank Whittle's first gas turbine aero engine was given its initial trials. This engine was designed and built with the assistance of the BTH Company. The firm of Power Jets Limited had been formed to proceed with its development. After working under Whittle's direction at a small factory near Rugby, the firm moved in 1943 to a new factory near Leicester, built for them by the government. Here, rapid progress was made in the development and manufacture of Whittle engines. This is a model of the W2 700 engine, which, although weighing only slightly more than the original flight engine, developed 3 times the power. The way in which the Whittle jet engine works is simple. Air is drawn into the engine by a centrifugal compressor. Although similar to the compressor of an ordinary aero engine supercharger, it is much larger, handling more than 10 times the amount of air. After being compressed, the air passes to the combustion chambers, where it is heated by a spray of burning paraffin or petrol. The heated air and products of combustion then pass straight to the turbine, which is driven round at speeds up to nearly 20,000 revolutions per minute. The turbine in turn drives the compressor, to which it is directly coupled. A large part of the energy in the heated air is absorbed by the turbine, to enable it to drive the compressor and fuel pump. The remaining energy is used directly in the jet to drive the plane forward. In May 1941, the first flight of a British jet-propelled aeroplane took place. Built by the Gloster Aircraft Company and powered by a Whittle engine, the E-28 was purely an experimental plane. With this plane, much useful flying experience was obtained. The absence of noise and vibration in the cockpit, coupled with the simplicity of the controls, greatly impressed the pilots. E-28 can now be seen in the Science Museum, South Kensington. Here is the prototype of the RAF's first jet fighter, the Gloster Meteor. The early Meteors were powered by Rolls-Royce Welland engines. These were a development of the Whittle W2B engine. The first RAF squadron to be equipped with Meteors was number 616. After carrying out their initial training at Farnborough, they transferred to Manston Aerodrome, Kent, in the summer of 1944. While at Manston, they went into action against the flying bombs, and were found to be the most successful of our fighters, shooting down the greatest number of bombs per flying hour. Four years later, the first British Aircraft Constructors' Show to be held at Farnborough took place in September 1948. Although piston engines were still in evidence, jets were very much to the fore. Next to the standard Meteor stood the first Meteor trainer, recently returned from a successful tour of Europe. In it, Gloucester's chief test pilot, Bill Waterton, had given several continental countries their first experience of a jet plane's speed and grace. Close by stood the de Havilland Ghost-engined Vampire, the first jet plane to hold the world's altitude record. The first single-engine jet fighter specially designed for the Navy. Powered by a Neen, its short twin jet pipes allow extra space for fuel tanks and thus give it increased range. The first jet-driven all-wing aircraft, the AW-52. The first four-jet airliner, the Neen-engined Tudor 8, 2 days after making its maiden flight. And the world's first jet airliner, the experimental Neen Viking. And here comes the first jet flying boat, piloted by Geoffrey Tyson. The Saunders Row naval fighter doesn't seem to mind which way up it flies. Its two Metropolitan Vickers axial flow turbines give it great speed and maneuverability. The Meteor Mark IV takes off. Here comes the Vampire. Some expert aerobatics by John Derry. Hawker naval fighter. The Meteor trainer. The AW-52. And so, to the future. Jet-propelled airliners will fly fast and at great heights. The world will grow smaller.
We were running into all sorts of difficulties in 37 and 38, not the least of which was the financial problem. because our financial backers were expecting miracles, I suppose. They thought we would have an aero engine within a matter of weeks. Well, of course, we had breakdown after breakdown, and they began to lose heart. And they did not produce the money that they promised. They had an option, you see, to produce a certain amount of money after a certain amount of time, and they obviously got cold feet. The result of that was that the control of the company passed into the hands of Williams, Tilling and myself. It didn't give us any money, but one of the conditions that we made for Falcon Partners to stay in the job was that they found a certain amount of money, and they did, in fact, put in another £3,000. And we were further helped by the fact that the BTH accepted 2,400 shares instead of £2,400 for a reconstruction of the engine. When we were in financial difficulty, the Air Ministry were very hesitant to help because we were in financial difficulty. There was a catch-22 situation going on. They said, this is a company backed by the city, Falcon Partners being a city company, who are just out to make money quick. And here they are running out of money. They don't have the courage to put money in. We're not going to risk our money. And so, as I say, you had a catch-22 situation. But they did, after we'd first run the engine and shown that it at least was self-driving, they did agree to a very limited contract, £200 an hour for running of the second edition for 10 hours. That would have been 10,000, 2,000 who had managed to complete it, £1,000 for a report on what had happened up to then, and so forth. A contract which totalled about £5,000. But there was another catch-22 situation came out of that, because as soon as they gave us a contract, we came under the Official Secrets Act and couldn't raise private money. Because you can't go to people and say, look, we've got a wonderful idea, put some money into it, we can't tell you what it is. So the acceptance of a contract from the ministry virtually stopped us from raising private money.
However, you had in, I think, Sir Henry Tizard, and I think also in Arthur Tedder, some fairly staunch friends during 37, 38, 39.
One of the big factors in our in the course of the development was that we enlisted the interest of Air Marshal Tedder and Sir Henry Tizard. Sir Henry at that time was chairman of the Aeronautical Research Council, and he, you might say, was a believer in gas turbines, and fortunately too he seemed to be a believer in me. He seemed to think that I knew what I was doing, and I think in the light of event he would possibly right. And Tedder came up to see what we were doing and saw the engine run and was suitably impressed. And he became a convert and decided to back the project.
But at that time, the Director of Scientific Research and the DDSR from the Air Ministry, what was their attitude? The
Director of Scientific Research had been converted about a little earlier than Tedder and Tizard, because he was more intimately connected with it. But he'd been a sceptic, you know, up to about June 1939. He'd been giving us the money, what little he did give us, on the basis that it was long-term research. And he thought it would contribute to what was going on at Farnborough.
And, of course, at that point, was it 1937, 38? Can you just give me this back? At that time, you had from Farnborough, in the person of A.A. Griffith, a rather unsatisfactory report.
When, just after the engine first ran and we'd submitted a report to the Air Ministry, this was the subject of another report by Griffith, the man who turned the job down in the early days, and his report damned it with faint praise. He brought in all the difficulties, said that no propeller meant that we wouldn't have the slipstream to help us take off, and so forth. And his final conclusion was more or less that it might have some use if high performance were needed for a very short time. I don't know why Griffith reached that conclusion. except that he seemed to ignore what we were trying to do. He talked as though the whole idea was to fly just where the Spitfire and other aeroplanes were flying, namely at heights up to, say, 20,000 feet and so forth. He didn't seem to register that we were aiming to fly at 40,000, 50,000 feet, well, even 60,000 feet.
Fine, I come now to Dr. David Pye, and June the 30th, I think, 1939, wasn't it? Can you tell me what happened on that day, the 30th of June?
On June the 30th of 1939, we managed to get a big breakthrough in the attitude of the Air Ministry, in that Pye, Director of Scientific Research, came up to see the engine run, and we managed to keep it going for about 20 minutes in his presence at 16,500 RPM, at which speed it pulled about 860 pounds of thrust, and he became a complete convert. So much so that he agreed that an engine for flight should be ordered, and that an aeroplane to use it should be ordered too.
Perhaps you could give me that little anecdote about driving him back to the station.
An odd thing was that he became such a convert that when I drove him back to the station to get his train back to London, I had the curious experience of hearing him explain to me all the advantages of the engine, that it could run on any fuel, that it was vibrationless, etc., etc. When the ministry decided we got a good project, they wanted to give an order for an aeroplane and for the engine. Well, they gave us the job of getting on with the engine, and we subcontracted the building of it to the BTH. We wanted them to give us the order for the aeroplane too, so that we could subcontract and thereby control it. But they wouldn't have that. They gave the contract direct to Gloster's. Well, that was fine, as it proved, because Gloster's, under Carter, proved to be very efficient. So the arrangement was satisfactory in the end. And we designed the W1 engine for flight, very similar to the original engine called the WU, but very much lighter. It was designed to produce a 1,240 pounds thrust, and the weight came out at about 620 pounds. The consequence of having to allow both for the difference in speed between the root and the tip of the blade, and for the difference in speed of the whirling air entering the blades, it meant doubling the twists of the blades. Another consequence of this way of designing was that it made a tremendous difference to the end load on the bearing. In fact, the end load of 1,800 pounds they'd been talking about virtually vanished.
Simplicity, I think, was the keynote of the first engine, wasn't it? The simple centrifugal compressor. Perhaps you could explain that.
We aimed to have the simplest possible engine to start with. There were certain alternatives open to us, the centrifugal compressor or the axial flow compressor. The centrifugal compressor is a very simple thing. It's simply a kind of glorified rotor, the kind that you have, say, in a vacuum cleaner, and with the diffuser blades on the outside. So there's just that single set of blades for the compressor, instead of the axial flow, which has many, many rows of blades, each of them having, say, 50 blades. So it's a much more complicated device. I sat on the fence and I took out my first patent because I had a two-stage axial flow with the centrifugal stage as a third stage. But when I came down to designing the engine, it had to be simple. So I selected the single-stage compressor, centrifugal type, with a single-stage turbine on the same shaft.
But the airflow was curved, in fact, wasn't it?
Well, not originally. Well, there were three sets, really. You might say the first was curved in that we used a single sausage-shaped combustion chamber. Then we went to a rather complicated one, which I won't attempt to explain now. And from that we went to what came to be known as the reverse flow kind. The reason for that being that we wanted to be able to use the same rotor assembly, that's compressor and turbine, that we had all along. And we could only do that by using reverse flow combustion.
You didn't go along with A.A. Griffiths altogether in the aerodynamic blades design. How were your blades designed?
Griffiths had a theory that you should design the blades as aerofoils. But I did not agree with that then, and I do not agree with it now. He argued that you should design the blades. I say that you should design the channels between the blades.
Which meant what?
The difference being that, since you are steering fluid through channels, clearly it's the channels that are important. If you make an aerofoil and then bend it to give the right kind of angles you need in a turbine, then you get constriction and divergence which you don't want in a channel.
Fine. This may be the point. In fact, I'd like to go over it again in this context. Can you tell me something now about the vortex blading theory and how it came to be an issue?
I found out by more or less by chance that the turbine blades being designed by the BTH were based on a quite different concept of blade design than what I thought was proper. And I didn't realise this until I'd left the blade design to them until I went to a meeting in the Deputy Chief Engineer's office, and where they were discussing a change in the blade design. And they were saying that one of the consequences of that change would be a change in the end thrust on the rotor. The load on the bearing, thrust bearing, would be 1,800 pounds instead of 150 or whatever it was. And I couldn't understand this. So I went away and thought about it. And I went up to the blade design office and asked one of the engineers there, L.J. Cheshire, I said, what do you assume to be the pressure difference between the root of the blades and the tip of the blades after the fluid leaves the nozzles? And he said, what pressure difference? So to my astonishment, I found that they did not assume that the air coming out of the nozzles was whirling, but that each pair of nozzles was sending out straight jets, which of course is not what happens.
And then if the effect of this was that you altered the blade, is it pitch or?
This particular, I pointed out that the fluid coming out of the nozzle ring would be a vortex, and the centrifugal pressure gradient meant there would be a corresponding difference in velocity. See, at the root, at the inside smaller diameter of a vortex, fluid is moving much faster than it is at the tips. You see that in water running out of a bathtub. And as the water moves nearer and nearer to the centre of the vortex, it spins faster and faster. Well, that's what happens in the flow out of a set of turbine nozzle rings. And to allow for that, it means you have to put a good deal of extra twist on the blades. In fact, double the twist that the BTH were putting on.
And that settled the problem. Right, I come now to Power Jets itself, the company in 1939. How many employees did you have, and how many of them were fully trained engineers?
In 1939, we only had just a handful of about half a dozen. And then beginning of 1940, we began to build up a team, and I was very careful in picking real quality. First-class honours Cambridge, first-class honours Oxford, Imperial College of Science, and so forth, Whitworth Scholars. Oh, I had quite a collection, and I think I can claim to have built up a brilliant team.
A young team?
A young team, yes, mainly. There were just, one was a little bit older than myself then, and then we added to that one of my former instructors. He became my deputy. He was quite a bit older than me. That was Wing Commander Lees.
And presumably for the young engineers, how were they recruited in terms of secrecy?
When we were recruiting young engineers, they came to this scruffy old foundry that we were now inhabiting, and were somewhat surprised, I think, when our managing director, as he had become, L.L. White, they went in this old ancient brick building up to rickety wooden stairs into an office with a beautiful carpet.
Farnborough had started, and indeed was the first research establishment in the world to start work on compressibility and transonic testing. And it started using the Spitfire 5 back in 1941.
Its boffins realised they had the key to supersonic flight.
So they issued a specification in 1943 for a supersonic research aircraft. And they chose a Miles aircraft to design, with the help of Farnborough, the actual aircraft.
This was designated the Miles M52.
One has to say they made a very good job of it. It had a special engine to be built by Frank Whittle, which was turbine fan with reheat. We believed we could reach 1,000 miles an hour. And the aircraft had also a biconvex wing, which was known as the Gillette wing. And thirdly, it had a flying tail.
This folds the tailplane and its elevator into one solid piece, which makes the aircraft more controllable as it nears supersonic speed.
I think because of the impression that I made, or so I'm told, with getting the Mozzie on the deck, they thought, we'll use this guy in the high-speed flight.
In 1944, Brown became the Navy's first pilot to fly a jet aeroplane. By contrast, no test pilot at Miles had yet flown one.
I was chosen to be the pilot on it for the simple reason that the fuselage at the pilot position was only 4 feet in diameter, and you couldn't get a pilot in there of more than 5 feet 8. In December 1945, when the aircraft was 92% ready for first flight, there arose a great problem that Frank Whittle, who was then running Power Jets, fell out with the establishment over the question of whether he or Rolls-Royce should produce production jet engines. It was ruled that Rolls-Royce should do it. He was so unhappy with this that he resigned from Power Jets. A month and a half later, the M52 was cancelled. I had already been given the date for the first flight, which was to be October 1946 at Boscombe Down. There was no prior notification given either to Miles or to Farnborough. And I was hopping mad, frankly, when I heard the decision.
Nobody would tell Brown why the M52 had been cancelled.
About 6 months before the cancellation, the Ministry of Aircraft Production had ordered that we receive a visit from the Americans, that everything be shown to them, nothing to be withheld from them whatsoever. They would even be given copies of all the reports and copies of the design work, etc. Without this visit, the Americans would not have advanced through the sound barrier with the X-1 as early as they did. I think it was certainly well within our grasp and taken away, and this is the galling thing, for a reason that up to today we are not sure why it was done.
Have you thought how your own life would have gone down a different avenue, perhaps?
Perhaps, yes. I wouldn't have relished it to the same degree, I don't think.
While waiting to fly the M52, Brown had been working at Farnborough on another project that would further expand the military potential of jet aeroplanes.
We were advertising, but of course we couldn't say what we were advertising for. And when we were interviewing them, we couldn't tell them what we wanted them for, although I think some of them guessed from the questions we asked.
Can you give me some idea of the costs, the Power Jet's total costs to 1939 compared with Germany?
Right from the start, we were working on a shoestring financially. £2,000 was the original sum subscribed, but dribs and drabs of money came in, £200 a friend of mine, £500 from a friend of someone else, and it built up slowly. And by 1939, we had spent, I don't know the actual figure, but I think it was about £7,000. In the balance sheet before July of 1939, the item to cost of unit was 4,000 and a few £100. So though we'd been going for over 2 years, we had, that's all we'd spent on the engine. We were doing monthly bill, BTX were doing it on a cost-plus basis, but fortunately for us, their overheads were only 150%.
The fact of the matter is, of course, that you were having to rebuild the engine out of old parts, and I think the official historian says that this really hampered progress quite considerably.
We were hampered repeatedly, not only by money difficulties, but by, well, they're associated with money difficulties. We couldn't afford to replace parts which had been damaged.
Overall, at this time, were you aware that Whitehall itself was troubled by what it felt to be the anomalous position of power jets?
I don't know what the position was of the ministry with all the various undertakings they were trying to give to various people. They were telling power jets they would protect us. They were trying to get undertakings from the Rover Company, which the Rover Company refused to give. They were trying to get undertakings from the BTH Company, which they were refusing to give. So they were in a first-class difficulty, really.
And it was this, presumably, that prompted their move towards Rolls-Royce, was it?
Well, the situation became so bad that it looked as though there would be a complete hash of everything. The Rover were making such a poor job of the engine that the order for the production of the Meteor was cut right back. And then Sir Wilfrid Freeman at the ministry wanted to hand the whole job over to Rolls-Royce. I successfully resisted that. I think I did anyway. But nevertheless, Rolls-Royce did come into the picture in a big way, in that it was agreed that they would take over the job from the Rover Company and hand over to the Rover Company their tank engine, diesel engines they were making. And from the moment that Rolls-Royce took over, the picture changed completely.
How was the picture then at Clitheroe at Barn Oldswick at that time? Did you know?
At the end of 1942, Rovers were just staggering along, getting 30 hours running out of, say, 6 engines. And as soon as my feeling is that they didn't want it to work because they wanted their B-26 to supersede the W2B. Anyway, when Rolls-Royce took over, within 1 month, the running time jumped more than tenfold to over 400 hours.
And one of the main agents, at any rate, one of them behind this was Sir Stanley Hooker. What was your relationship with him, or Dr. Hooker, as then called?
The leading people in the Rolls-Royce team, which brought about this revolution, you might call it, was headed by Stanley Hooker. Dr. Hooker, as he then was, and Stanley Hooker as he became later. He was a great leader. In 3 months, he and the team he had at Barn Oldswick had the engine up to its full design performance, and in fact, shortly after, they improved on it. And the main reason they did that was they made a modification to the turbine, which I'd recommended 2 years earlier. That was just altering the angle of the turbine blades through 5 degrees, and that put the engine right, and it was able to go through its type test at full design performance.
In 1923, Frank Whittle joined the Royal Air Force. The 20s and early 30s were the formative years of the RAF. It was small, select, highly trained. RAF aircraft followed the fashions of the day, no longer constructed of wood, it is true, but still fabric-covered, wire-braced biplanes, differing little in essentials from the machines that had fought over the trenches in the closing stages of the Great War. On joining the RAF as an aircraft apprentice, Frank Whittle was trained as an airframe rigger, a trade he was never in fact to practice, for on completion of the 3 years course, he was selected to a much-coveted cadetship at the then newly created RAF College at Cranwell, where he learnt to fly and was duly commissioned as a pilot.
So I first went solo on the Avro 504K, and then on the Avro Lynx, then from there to the Bristol Fighter, then the DH-9A, and then on to the Siskin in my last term.
To be an RAF pilot was in those days a most agreeable position for a young man, flying from neat grass airfields all graced with well-appointed messes, a chain of exclusive flying clubs stretching from Britain across the Empire. The biplanes of the 30s, like these Hawker Harts, could achieve sea-level speeds of around 180 miles an hour. The fastest single-seater of the time only managed just over 200. But as they climbed into the thinner air, their performance dropped drastically, a characteristic of the piston-engine propeller combination. Frank Whittle, while a cadet at Cranwell, had written a paper, Future Trends of Aircraft Design, in which he had predicted speeds of up to 500 miles an hour. This would be impossible to achieve with biplanes due to the drag inherent in their design. For however powerful their engines, the maximum speed of a practical biplane would be limited to around 250 miles per hour. The 1929 Supermarine S-6 Schneider Trophy seaplanes were to prove the point. That year, their 2,300 horsepower Rolls-Royce R engines had enabled them to win the trophy at 340 miles an hour. Later, in 1931, with still more power, one of them became the world's first aircraft to exceed 400 miles an hour in level flight. Yet in a sense, the Supermarine S-6s were a red herring. Their very success obscured the fact that their performance was very nearly the practical limit obtainable, a fact that Cadet Whittle had realized at Cranwell.
One of the things that I did was work out what I now know was the well-known Breguet equation, which indicated that if you wanted to fly both fast and far, you'd had to fly at such a height that it was quite beyond the, and at such a speed, that it was quite beyond the piston engine and propeller combination.
In Germany, Fritz von Opel had in 1929 constructed an experimental aircraft to demonstrate that powered flight without a propeller was a feasible proposition. Opel used a number of solid fuel rockets to power a glider. It flew just, but its maximum duration of 10 minutes hardly foreshadowed an aerodynamic revolution. Opel's experiments made no impression on the aero engine manufacturers, who continued to construct their heavy, intricate piston engines, though now employing the new technique of supercharging, that is, using impellers, high-grade paddle wheels driven by the engine, to pump the petrol-air mixture into the cylinders in an attempt to maintain sea-level performance in the thin air of high altitude. However efficient the designers and metallurgists made the power plants, the weak link at high altitude, the propeller, remained. Searching for an alternative, Frank Whittle at first considered using a piston engine to drive a compressor, pumping air into a jet pipe with burners, but he rejected the idea as hopelessly inefficient, which indeed it was. That proposition had been one considered in his Cranwell paper.
I didn't have the complete idea then. I was just groping towards it. Then in 1929, the penny dropped, and the idea of the turbojet came to me.
But the principle of jet propulsion had been discovered much earlier in 120 BC by Hero of Alexandria. His engine consisted of two small jets angled from a globe of silver, fed by a boiler through supporting pillars. With pressure up, the steam jets propelled the globe. Thus man's first known heat engine was jet-propelled. 1600 years later, Sir Isaac Newton formalized the effect as his third law of motion. For each action, there exists an equal and opposite reaction. And if James Watt's celebrated observation of the boiling kettle's lid had applied Newton's law instead to the spout, he could have invented the turbine. Like this simple steam turbine, the gas turbine which Frank Whittle proposed is extremely simple, having only two major moving parts. The compressor wheel on the left and the turbine on the right, both keyed to a single shaft and housed within a pressure casing. The compressor's impeller forces air into the casing, which also contains a number of combustion chambers in which fuel, kerosene, is continually burnt. The expanding gases resulting from combustion pass through the turbine, turning it at very high speeds, up to 17,000 RPM, before exhausting from the jet pipe with enough velocity, 1,000 pounds in the early engine, to push the aircraft forward in powered flight. In 1930, that was still all theory. Undaunted, Frank Whittle patented his gas turbine on the 14th of October in that year. The high-speed monoplanes, which could conceivably utilize a jet engine, now existed, at least in prototype. But Frank Whittle knew that to construct a practical gas turbine aero engine was going in many ways to be a much more formidable undertaking. The massive 36-litre Rolls-Royce engine, which had powered the Schneider Trophy seaplanes, had required the most intensive research, not only into the very special chemistry of the fuels, but also into the then unknown territory of high-pressure supercharging. Rolls-Royce, with the aid of the Royal Aircraft Establishment, finally, after a great deal of work, managed to achieve a supercharger that could efficiently compress the mixture to twice sea-level atmosphere, and that in 1929 was considered to be very good going indeed. Frank Whittle had calculated that for his gas turbine he would require a much larger and far more efficient compressor, working at 4 times that pressure. The calculations for the compressor were included in a paper which Whittle wrote to prove the case for the gas turbine. But none of the aero engine manufacturers were in the least interested in his proposals, at a time when meagre orders for existing engines were hardly sufficient to keep the firm solvent. One obvious conclusion drawn from the Schneider Trophy was that the days of the biplane were numbered. The Air Ministry was therefore experimenting with monoplanes like this long-range Fairey. To spend the money instead on exotic engines, which could at best take years to develop, was out of the question. So to cool his ardor, the Air Ministry posted their young inventor to the Marine Aircraft Experimental Establishment at Felixstowe to discover how a land plane behaved in water. Frank Whittle also made 47 experimental catapult launches. One was to prove memorable, for his passenger was thrown out but managed to grab hold of the tailplane as he left.
I took a quick glance over my shoulder, and I saw there was a body on the tailplane, but I didn't know it was my passenger. Until I found I wasn't losing control entirely. I'd got the stick right forward, full throttle. I took a more collected look and saw that it was my passenger, who then was struggled round into a sitting position with his back against the fin wire. And when he saw me look round with his helmet blowing out and his cheeks blowing out, he gave me a thumbs up sign with his spare hand. The other one was holding onto the fin. And I saw him go, okay. I thought to myself, well, you may think you're okay, old boy, but we can't get down. Because every time I tried to pull the throttle back, I couldn't hold up his weight.
He couldn't turn either, due to his passenger leaning on the rudder, which was embarrassing since a German liner was dead ahead. The question was,
could I get back onto the water before I flew into the side of the ship? I managed it. The German ship turned to port, which was taking a bit of a risk in those shallow waters. This was just off the Isle of Wight.
In the summer of 1932, Whittle was posted to an engineering course at Henlow, which he passed with 98% marks. He then went up to Peterhouse College, Cambridge, to read for a mechanical engineering tripos. During those 4 years of study in that biplane era, Frank Whittle deplored the lost opportunities and had, by 1936, begun to face up to the reality of the continued rejection of his gas turbine engine.
I began to think it was before its time. In fact, I allowed the patent to lapse. And then along came Dudley Williams, now Sir Ralph Dudley Williams, or at least he wrote to me first, And then I saw him afterwards. He said he thought he could raise some money to get the thing going. And he and a partner did, in fact, manage to contact a small outfit called, commercial bankers called Falcon Partners. And they agreed to put up some money. And as a result of that, Power Jets was formed in March of 1936. But before the company was actually formed, Falcon Partners agreed to place an order with the BTH for the manufacturing drawings of an experimental engine.
To this day, Sir Frank still has the original drawing board, which was in 1936 Power Jet's principal asset.
The first jet engine was drawn on that. The BTH first drawing I wasn't satisfied with, so I did a half-scale drawing on this board, and that was the basis of the experimental engine. Power Jets had no staff except me, and I was on loan from the Air Ministry as a squadron leader.
So the initial practical work was contracted out to the British Thomson Houston Company at their Rugby's steam turbine works, where gradually the strange engine took shape. Casing, combustion chamber, the impeller of the compressor, and the turbine. By the 12th of April 1937, the engine stood complete and ready for testing. The question nobody liked to ask was, would it work?
When we first tried to start it up, we certainly succeeded. I was on the controls, and we got the thing running up to 1,000 RPM, and I got a signal from one of the fitters that there was a light up in the combustion chambers, and I signaled for the speed to be raised to 2,000 RPM, which was done with an electric motor. And then I opened the main fuel control to get it going under its own power, and it certainly did. It accelerated out of control, and so did everyone standing around. Except me, I was paralyzed with fright. I thought maybe we'd got something which we couldn't control. It went up to about half full speed, up to about 8,000 RPM, and then fortunately stopped accelerating. The reason was that there was a lake of fuel collected in the combustion chamber which we didn't know anything about.
On its second run, the engine seized solid at 12,000 RPM. It was rebuilt and then run up to 13,000 RPM with, Sir Frank remembers, a noise like an air raid siren. After those early test runs, the BTH management, not unreasonably, decided that a move to a rather more rural location was perhaps desirable. In the village of Lutterworth, the company owned a derelict property known as Ladywood Works, the name being a great deal grander than the location.
Oh, God, it was terrible. It was an old, disused iron foundry. They were the rickety old floors. Old Whittle had an office rather like a rabbit hutch, you know, and it was a really terrible place. It had one test bed, as I remember. I can't remember what the workshops were like, but it was a pathetic setup, really.
With delays caused by the move and the chronic shortage of everything, especially money, it took a year to rebuild the engine, which seized up, to be yet again rebuilt in its third and final form, to become the prototype of the engine which would eventually fly, with the 10 interconnected combustion chambers. These were to prove one of the most difficult components of the engine to get right. This is that original Whittle engine, the first in the world to run, now preserved in the Science Museum, London. Incredibly, in spite of being constructed from salvaged parts, it ran remarkably well.
It was getting up to speeds of about 16,500. By the time we were getting it to this stage, it had been through so many mishaps that it was really a heap of junk. And so when I look back on it, it rather surprises me that we got it up to 16,500.
That was in June 1939. By then the Germans had annexed Austria and the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia. The Munich crisis of September 1938 had passed, and of the peace in our time, then predicted by Neville Chamberlain, just 3 months remained. Since 1933, when Hitler first came to power, the Luftwaffe had been training and growing, secretly at first, then openly, until by 1938 it was revealed to have achieved and surpassed parity with the RAF. there was to be little doubt as to the quality of the Luftwaffe. For example, the Stuka dive bomber, which was soon to spearhead the Blitzkrieg, and the Ju-88, conceived in 1935 as a Schnell bomber, a bomber with the performance of contemporary fighters. To counter the Luftwaffe expansion, the RAF began to rearm. In 1936, the prototype of R.J. Mitchell's Spitfire had flown, as had the Hurricane, and both were now in full production to re-equip the fighter squadrons of the RAF, many of which were to fly biplanes until mid-1939. In the 12 months' grace between Munich and the outbreak of war, the long years of neglect of the RAF were to some extent made good. By September 1939, Fighter Command was at last equipped with modern aircraft, backed by an efficient radar-based fighter control system, and was considered to be able to counter the Luftwaffe. However, if anyone at the Air Ministry had thought that the German aero engine industry might have made the transition from their turbo superchargers to a gas turbine and be producing a German jet, then their appreciation went unheeded. In point of fact, the Germans had already made that step. It was the experimental Heinkel 178, powered by a jet engine designed by a young physicist from Göttingen University, Hans Pabst van Oene, who in 1936 had approached Ernst Heinkel with a proposal to build a gas turbine. Heinkel agreed to provide the facilities and finances for von Oene to build an experimental turbine which ran on hydrogen. The turbine produced only 176 pounds of thrust, but it impressed Heinkel sufficiently for him to back the development of a flight engine. With the backing of a large aircraft factory, the engine, similar to Frank Whittle's, was built and bench-tested by the winter of 1938. On completion, the engine was installed in the specially built HE-178, which was ready by the 27th of August 1939 to make the world's first gas turbine-powered flight. Von Oene remembers the day well.
Well, we had a short airfield. Wasitz had already, the day before, taxied the aircraft, and he thought he could make it. It was an early morning, slightly foggy, but only very slightly foggy. And he accelerated. It worked without any problem. He lifted up, and then we lost him because he went on straight, and we didn't hear anything anymore. And so we waited, and then 5 minutes, a very long time, then he came back, then he curved around, and we wondered why he is not landing. And so we felt, oh, he feels very good there. But the fact was that he couldn't really see, because the glare of that fog, he said, was terrible. The sun came up, and when he wanted to land, it was such a glare he couldn't really exactly see the airfield. So he made several rounds until he could really safely set down.
Test pilot Wasitz, Heinkel and von Oene celebrated with a champagne breakfast, perhaps a little prematurely, for 5 days later Germany was at war. In stark contrast to the plenty enjoyed by von Oene, Frank Whittle struggled with his single battered engine and was in those last weeks of peace suffering from an early example of catch-22.
Because the power jets was on the point of going broke, the Air Ministry was very reluctant to place any contracts, you see. They thought the firm was too rocky. But we were getting small contracts, you know, £5,000, and then they paid for the second reconstruction of the engine, about £2,400, and altogether, by the time the engine was showing signs of being worthwhile, we'd spent about £20,000 all told, private money and Air Ministry money. But the real turning point was when the Director of Scientific Research came to Lutterworth, where we were testing the engine, and saw it run up to 16,500 RPM, and he became, for the first time, completely sold. Up to that time, they'd been paying the money on the basis that the job was really long-term research.
One result of that official visit was that all of Power-Jet's work became subject to the Official Secrets Act, which made raising capital even more difficult. But the Air Ministry had at least bought the long-suffering original engine and had placed a contract for a flight engine, the W-1, to power an experimental aircraft which the Gloster Company were to design and build, the Gloster Whittle E-2839. But it was still on the drawing board when the Second World War broke out, and all that Power-Jets had was a model. The war, at first, at least in Britain and France, called the Phony War, was soon to change, to become the reality of Dunkirk and the Battle of Britain. That summer, Frank Whittle and his small staff still had the problem of finding an established aero-engine manufacturer, for although the E-2839 had yet to fly, it now had a successor, a twin-engine fighter, eventually to be named Meteor, to follow the purely experimental Gloster Whittle. The obvious choice, Rolls-Royce, were like the other major companies fully stretched, supplying aero-engines for war production. Another difficulty was Frank Whittle's concern that a big company might absorb Power-Jets, whose patent position was far from satisfactory.
The patent position was not strong. The first master patent having lapsed. We had several other patents, but I didn't think that the patent position was very strong. So we were looking for subcontractors who were not likely, as we thought, to start competing with us. And it's happened that the wife of one of our directors was a friend of the wife of a director of the Rover Company, and as a result of that, we invited the Rover Company to act as subcontractors to us, which they agreed to do. The Rover Company, I'm afraid, made a shambles of the job, and their behaviour was, I think, absolutely disgraceful. They were out to get direct contracts, which they succeeded in doing. They did all sorts of dirty tricks. For instance, they got permission from the ministry to be responsible for the drawings. Well, on one occasion, manufacturing drawings, on one occasion we asked them to let us have a drawing of the compressor casing. And when it came, we found that it was, you might say, a breach of copyright, because it was in a photostat of one of our own drawings with all reference to Power-Jets removed, as though it were a Rover Company drawing. But unfortunately for them, they'd left in the bottom right-hand corner the names of our draftsmen, so that it was pretty obvious that it was merely a photostat of our drawing. And after that, I became much keener on getting Rolls-Royce into the picture.
The first Rolls-Royce man to visit Power-Jets was Stanley Hooker.
Well, it was in January 1940 when Hayne Constant, who was the Director of Engine Research at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, took me to Lutterworth to see the engine. I'd never heard anything about it before. Constant used to come to Derby to discuss the Merlin supercharger with me. And one day he said, I'm going to take you to see this jet engine, which was secret at the time. I met Whittle, and then he showed me his engine and discussed it with me, described it and so forth. And I can't say I was an immediate convertee to jet propulsion. I hadn't really studied it sufficiently for that. But I must say that standing by his engine when it was running, and they used to run more or less in the open in those days, one always had a sensation here was tremendous power, you know.
Stanley Hooker's brilliant work on the supercharger for the Merlin shared common ground with Whittle's jet compressor.
Lutterworth wasn't very far away, of course, only 30 miles or so. And I, having met Whittle and got on very well with him from the beginning, I used to go and see him fairly frequently. In fact, I used to take him Merlin supercharger the results to look at, because, you see, he had no tests of his own supercharger. There wasn't a plant big enough in the country to test it. So I used to take him these things, and we had a lot of discussion. And eventually, when his engine was running at about 1,000 pounds of thrust, I went to see Hives, Lord Hives, or Mr. Hives as he was at the time, and tried to persuade him to go to Lutterworth and see the engine. And he said, "What does it do?" And I said, "Well, it's giving about 1,000 pounds of thrust." Well, now, we were all used to horsepower. We knew the Merlin gave 1,000 horsepower more. And one must admit that 1,000 pounds of thrust doesn't sound much compared with 1,000 horsepower. And Hives turned to me and said, "Well, that's not much, is it? You know, they wouldn't pull the skin off a rice pudding, would it?" And I went away and did a sum, and went back to him and said, "Do you know how much thrust the Merlin gives in a Spitfire?" And he said, "No, how much?" And I said, 1,000 pounds. And he immediately rang for his secretary and said, "I'm going down to see this engine with Hooker on Sunday."
And what was Hives' impression?
Oh, he went down, he came, he saw he was conquered, you know, it was literally that, really. He didn't say much, he walked around, and Whittle described it all to him, gave him proper tour. At the end of it, he turned to Whittle and said, "I don't see many engines about, Whittle." He said, why haven't you got more engines?" And Whittle said, "Well, I look at the facilities I've got. I can't get anything made, I can't get this, and I've got no money," and so on and so forth. And Hives turned to him and said, "Well, send us the drawings and we'll make the stuff for you." And we made quite a lot of components at Derby for Whittle to help him with his job.
The Battle of Britain was by then at its height. The epic victory of the Spitfires and Hurricanes requires no retelling here, but it is pertinent to ask, if Frank Whittle had been better supported, could a developed British jet have made any difference to the struggle? In the absence of German jets, probably not. During the battle, there was never a shortage of RAF aircraft, but of pilots, and the existing Spitfires and Hurricanes carried the day, which was just as well, because the Gloster Whittle was not rolled out until the spring of 1941, fitted with a non-flight Whittle engine, the W-1X, to commence taxiing trials.
It was really a lash-up engine, which is why we call it the W1X, W1 Experimental. And that was used for the taxiing trials of this aeroplane.
It was taxied at Hucklecote on the 7th of April 1941 by Frank Whittle. He opened the W1X engine to 13,000 RPM, but the grass airfield was soggy and the best speed obtained was a mere 20 miles per hour. The next day, Gloucester's test pilot opened up to 15,000 RPM, and it was clear that the flight engine should provide adequate thrust for flight. As it was, it would seem that the W1X also had hidden reserves, as witnessed by Bob Fielden.
Then the pilot, Jerry Sayre, did just a short hop on a grass airfield, jet-propelled. So it really was one of the moments of my life. And I might record that afterwards, one of the other pilots, Mr. Michael Daunt, said to me, "Thank God it flew straight." I said, "What on earth do you mean?" He said, "Well, we all thought it was going to squib around like a squib firework."
The W1X engine used for the taxiing trials was removed from the aircraft and sent to the United States, and the 1,000-pound thrust W1 flight engine was installed in the prototype. Ground running had proved that the W1 engine would have no difficulties providing the minimum thrust, around 900 pounds, required for flight. This unique colour film of the original E-2839 was taken by a Power Jets engineer, Matthew Nathan, after the first flight made at Cranwell just 40 years ago.
On the day, 15th of May, 41, the weather during the day was too bad for other than taxiing trials until the evening. And then Jerry Sayre just took it to the end of the runway, ran it up to the maximum speed that the ministry would permit, which was 16,500, holding it on the brakes, let go of the brakes, and he was off in 600 yards, and just disappeared from sight in the clouds, and was flying for about 17 minutes, and then came in doing quite steep gliding turns, as though he'd been flying the airplane for weeks.
There were depressingly few to witness the event, and the only known record of that historic occasion is a still photograph and a fragment of 16mm.
Frank, it flies, and my I suppose I was tense or something, and my comment was, well, that was what it was bloody well supposed to do, wasn't it?
The marked lack of official interest on the occasion of the first flight still rankles with Sir Frank 40 years on.
Only a group of, from Power Jets and a group from Gloucesters, and the group from Power Jets included the resident technical officer from the ministry. But there were no official representatives, and what I think was rather a scandal, there was no attempt to make any official films of the whole affair. And so no good film of those first flights exists.
By contrast, there exists excellent film of Germany's second jet, the twin-engined Heinkel 280. The construction and first flight of their original jet, the 178, had been so secret that not even the German Air Ministry had been aware of it. After the successful test flights became officially known, orders for 9 prototype 280s followed, with the promise that if satisfactory, substantial production orders could well follow. In a remarkably short time, von Ohain, backed by the full facilities of the Heinkel works, had designed and built a new turbojet, which gave 1,250 pounds of thrust on the bench to power the new aircraft, itself in many ways a most advanced concept which can claim a number of firsts. It was the first twin-engine jet, the first with a tricycle undercarriage, and the first to fit and later to use an ejector seat. The 280 was the second jet in the world to fly. The first prototype, this is actually the third, had flown from this runway at Marianair, the Heinkel Company factory airfield, on the 2nd of April 1941, 6 weeks before the British jet, the Gloster Whittle, was to fly. It's instructive, therefore, to see the progress that could be achieved given adequate backing, and there is no doubt whatsoever that if Whittle's project had enjoyed the same facilities, the Meteor could also have flown by this time. Although the 280 achieved over 500 miles an hour and bettered an FW-190 in mock combat, no mean achievement, it did not, for political reasons, go into production. Neither did von Ohain's engines. The sole Allied jet in 1941, the E-2839, was, after its inaugural flight, extensively used to test fly a new Whittle engine, the W2B, installed in the Meteor. The E-2839 proved to be capable of 440 miles an hour with an absolute ceiling of 56,000 feet, fully vindicating Frank Whittle's early claims for turbojets. However, the Whittle W2B was to prove a most difficult engine to develop.
I think many members of the team wished that we had gone ahead with the W1 air-cooled engine, W1A, rather than pushing ahead with the more advanced W2 series of engines, because the W1 engine had flown successfully, 10 hours flying with a brand new aircraft, brand new propulsion system, and never with the engine covers open once. And that, I think, must be an all-time record in aviation.
That success of the E-2839 led in some ways to an over-optimistic program for the Meteor. The ministry required 1,200 Whittle engines and 500 airframes. The question concerning Frank Whittle was who was to produce the engines. Relations with the Rover Company were then so bad that S.B. Wilkes, the managing director, went to Rolls-Royce to see his old friend Ernest Hives.
Hives sent for me one day and said, look, we're going up to Clitheroe tonight. We're going to have dinner with S.B. Wilkes. He didn't say why. So off we went, and we had dinner in the Swan and Royal in Clitheroe, old pub there. And after dinner, old Hives turned to Wilkes with his usual abruptness and twinkle in his eye, always did it humorously, really. He said, you know, you're making a hell of a mess of this jet job, aren't you? You don't get on with Whittle. And Wilkes said, yeah. He said, well, I don't know what you're doing with it. He said, you grub about on the ground, you know. It's an aircraft engine, it's our meat, not yours. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you our tank engine factory at Nottingham. You give me this jet job. And Wilkes said I should be glad to get rid of it. And so we got all the rover facilities at Clitheroe and Barnoldswick.
And that memorable dinner got Rolls-Royce into the jet aero engine business.
In the light of subsequent history, it was a remarkable dinner altogether. It was one of those 5 bob ones, you know, wartime 5 bob dinners. I can't remember whether Hives paid or Wilkes paid. I expect Wilkes did. Old Hives didn't would pull that one over, I expect. But it was a fantastic deal for Rolls-Royce as things turned out.
Next day, the two men went to the rover jet production factory that Rolls-Royce had just acquired.
And Hives looked around and said, this will do as the experimental shop. Forget about production. We've got to get this engine right first, and then we'll produce it as easy as easy.
The resources of what was, and arguably still is, the greatest producer of aero engines in the world was now at the disposal of power jets, with foundries able to cast intricate parts in steel or high-duty alloys, virtually unlimited stocks of high-grade steels and other metals, together with a large and highly skilled workforce able to utilize to the full the facilities available. A certain urgency was now attached to jet engine production. Mosquitoes of the ARIA photographic reconnaissance units had been bringing back disquieting evidence, wispy outlines of unknown delta-winged aircraft and scorch marks on the grass airfields at Lechfeld, Peenemünde and Rechlin, the German equivalent of Boscombe Down, where this photograph was taken. These scorch marks were known to have been made by experimental jet aircraft. They could well have been made by the Messerschmitt 163, a lineal descendant of Opel's amusing rocket glider. The delta-winged 163 Comet, powered by a lightweight, liquid-fueled Walter rocket, had been designed as an interceptor fighter and possessed a truly amazing rate of climb. In October 1941, the prototype had broken the existing world speed record at over 623 miles an hour on the edge of the sound barrier. Rocket planes apart, a new jet was being tested in Germany by 1943. It was the Arado 234 Blitz bomber, the only jet bomber to see service in World War II, which it did during the Battle of the Bulge. But fortunately for the Allies, the 234 had suffered from a common weakness of German wartime research: too little and too late. Hitler had banked on a short war. By the time it was clear that this was not to be, there was insufficient time to develop the promising early prototypes, which in 1941, with victory scented, had been postponed. But there was another fundamental reason for delay. The Arado, for example, had been held up for 12 months, while the Junkers company under Dr. Franz were developing their jet engine, the Junkers UMO 004. It was certainly an advanced concept, an axial engine, that is, the simple, reliable Whittle-type compressor being replaced by these multiple blades, a difficult engine to get right even today, but it was theoretically more efficient, presenting a smaller cross-section, important in high-speed flight. Two were fitted in Germany's most successful jet fighter, the Me-262. The first flight was from the Messerschmitt factory airfield at Liebheim near Ulm. The date was July the 19th, 1942, and the pilot, Flugkapitän Fritz Wendel, who, in the absence of a propeller slipstream over the elevators, had to apply the brakes at 112 miles an hour as he passed a white line across the runway. He was later to report, "Immediately I touched the brakes, the tail lifted. The turbojets ran like clockwork, and indeed seldom have I been so enthusiastic during my first flight of a new aircraft." In fact, the 262 was tricky. The first two prototypes had flown with piston engines. This, the third prototype, was the first to fly on jet power alone. It had engines which required very careful handling. Too much throttle and the turbines burnt out, or the compressor stalled. Another unpleasant characteristic of those early axial engines was a pronounced lag in throttle response, which called for a very carefully judged landing approach. After the 17-minute first flight, test pilot Wendel slipped past the Gigant gliders that had been constructed in 1940 for the invasion of Britain, with just enough power on for a perfect approach and touchdown. But the moment he closed the throttles, no doubt in some relief, both jet engines immediately caught fire due to excess fuel igniting in the jet pipes. The fires were soon put out, but they were an omen of long delays caused by Luftwaffe indifference and later Hitler demanding that the fighter be capable of carrying bombs. There were other problems with the engine, and 262s were not to see action until October 1944 to intercept the high-flying B-17s of the US Army Air Force. Out of 1,500 built, there were probably fewer than 100 262s operational and never more than 15 serviceable at any one time, all flying with engines that were so underdeveloped that more 262 pilots were lost in flying accidents than in action. Nevertheless, had they been available in sufficient numbers with an engine as well developed as Whittle's, they could have made even the losses to the US 8th Army Air Force unacceptable. As it was, they joined the Luftwaffe's piston engine fighters in the great air battles over Germany in 1944, and 262s accounted for at least 100 American bombers shot down.
I see him. At 2 o'clock. Watch him, Scotty.
At that time, the only operational Allied jets were 16 Meteor 1s powered by Rolls-Royce Welland engines developed from Whittle's design. The aircraft were hastily converted from a training to an operational role for 616 Squadron, the first in the RAF to fly jets to intercept the very fast V-1 flying bombs. The first jet-versus-jet combats followed during the summer of 1944, though, admittedly, they were a little one-sided. The first American jet, the Bell P-59 Air Comet, was powered by 2 General Electric engines which were American copies of a Whittle W-1. The General Electric Company had built their version in just 4 months, but too late to see service. In September 1944, the Minister of Aircraft Production, Sir Stafford Cripps, visited Power Jets, and Whittle suggested the nationalization of the entire jet aero engine industry.
What I visualized was a single cohesive unit with Power Jets at the hub of it, you see. And I even thought it possible that I would be the chief engineer of the whole business, since we'd started it, and our engines were, in my opinion, still the best.
Sir Stafford came, saw, and confiscated. The only company to be nationalized was Power Jets itself, whose staff thus became civil servants. It was a blow to Frank Whittle, for with the end of the war within sight, the Miles Company had designed the M52, which was to have been Britain's first supersonic research aircraft, to be powered by a Whittle-designed engine, which would have been the first ducted fan. This and other projects were under intensive development. But the fate of the M52 project began a fashion to be followed by successive governments. In February 1946, when the design was 97% complete, it was cancelled, along with all the other advanced engine projects of Power Jets, which was to become simply a test facility for other companies' engines.
We were forbidden to design and make engines, and so that the people who'd started the whole business were robbed of the right to design and build engines.
Frank Whittle resigned from the board of Power Jets and retired from the Royal Air Force as Air Commodore. Most of his staff followed him and scattered throughout the industry at home and abroad. Thus, when the new shapes, some owing much to German high-speed research, were shown at the early post-war Farnborough shows, the major responsibility of British aero engine design and construction had passed to other hands. Frank Whittle's brilliant pioneering work was to give Britain its world lead in jet aero engine technology. It was, in the early post-war years, made freely available to all. Sir Stafford Cripps gave Rolls-Royce Nenes to Russia to found their jet engine industry and to power their MiG-15s over Korea. Britain's second jet fighter, the de Havilland Vampire, was begun during the war, but too late to see service. At the 1949 Farnborough, the de Havilland Comet was shown to the public. It was the world's first civil jet airliner, and although tragically flawed, was the herald of the jet age in which, sadly, Sir Frank Whittle was to take no practical part. Although knighted and rewarded, he remains bitter to this day.
Oh, yes, I am. But most bitter about firstly, the fact that the policy mismanagement delayed the use of the engine in the war. It did go into operation, but in quite a limited way. Didn't have any material effect on the war. I was bitter about that, because it needn't have been so. And but even more bitter about the removal of my right to design and make engines. And one consequence of that was that the ducted fan, which is now practically universal, turbofan, was delayed for at least 6 to 10 years.
This Device 76 is a small plane-like disguised bomb. Launched from a special cannon propelled by a pulse jet engine steered by an automatic control system, flying far distances to its great target and crashing with devastating effect via nosedive. Maximum fuselage length of 8.3 meters, wingspan of 5.4 meters. The plane consists of the following parts: fuselage, wing, empennage, engine, and in the front, the odometer. The wings are easily removable, attached to the spar bar. The individual fuselage parts, the pulse jet engine, spar bar and wings, are replaceable and are easy to replace. Simple connecting elements result in assembly times of only a few minutes. The fuselage consists of nose tip, nose, load space, middle part, and tailpiece. In the fuselage, various single devices are housed that are needed for completing the mission of a self-flying bomb. In the nose sits the long gear and the electric impact fuse. Behind them, the compass and a wooden sphere. The electric fuse sits in front of the explosives housing. The middle piece of the fuselage functions as a fuel tank, with a holding capacity of 680 liters. Behind that, the spherical bottle with compressed air of 160 atmospheres. Lately, there are 2 spherical bottles. In front and under the pulse jet engine is the engine regulator. Located in the tailpiece is the control unit, rudder machines, transmitter battery, transmitter and antenna. The site of impact is determined by the transmitter system. The device in original recording. The aircraft body is made out of sheet steel, using the most modern manufacturing processes of the time. Only in the front, at the nose of the fuselage, aluminium white metal was used due to compass manipulation. Fuselage nose with log, odometer. The air log is used to measure the distance covered. The load space over which the cable duct leads is a welded sheet metal container filled with high-quality explosives. In 4 places, the load space is connected to the middle section of the fuselage via Fredberg screw couplings. Here is the coupling. When launched, the 2.2-ton device is accelerated on this fitting with a force of 40 tons. The rear part of the fuselage with streamlined mounting of the pulse jet engine. At the rear, the pulse jet engine is mounted on a pendulum support with a rubber gasket. The antenna is only installed in machines equipped with the tracking transmitter. After the spear is inserted and attached to the fuselage, the wings are pushed on. The wings and spar are interchangeable and can be attached into any machine. Thanks to the special measuring methods, the wings have been brought to the correct adjustment angles. When mounted at the launch site, there are only 2 to be inspected for transport damages. The wings are now prevented from slipping out sideways by turning in a screw. Thanks to the simple construction, assembly is carried out within a few minutes. The elegantly sleek device reaches a speed of well over 600 km per hour. The pulse jet engine by Argus is used as the engine. How the engine works. The compressed air flows from the spherical bottle into the fuel tank and presses on the liquid level. This causes fuel to flow through the regulator to the engine. The outside air flows through the flap valves into the combustion chamber, in which fuel is injected at the same time. Only for the first ignition a spark plug is needed. The ignition for all subsequent working periods is on hot residual gas particles. The ignition creates a compression wave that runs to the open end of the pipe, and this turns into a dilution wave. It runs back and causes the flap valves to open. The steadily inflowing fuel forms, with the inflowing outside air, a fresh mixture. This dilution wave, which is reflected on the closed valve box and runs to the open end of the pipe, was also created during the ignition. Here, it transforms into a compression wave that runs back to the valve box and closes the flaps again. Repeated, the dilution wave opens the flaps. The overpressure or compression wave closes them again. The acceleration of gas particles that are ejected at the open end of the pipe is connected to the wave process. The outflow at great speeds creates thrust in the direction of the arrow. The physics of the moving gas waves is the invisible secret of the pipe. What is difficult to understand in theory is shown to us by the slow-motion camera at the test stand, the pulsating work of the pulse jet. The following details are of the engine on device 76. The pipe in flight condition. Hood removed. The hood is used to cover the aerodynamically unfavorable pipe head. The tube is suspended from the fork with rubber bearings. In front of the valve box, which contains the air valves, the lines for fuel and starting air. Flap box removed. The cover protects the flap box from the flame and improves the mixture preparation. The thrust tube itself is just a sheet of metal tube, an engine of the utmost simplicity. Here is the flap box from the front, with many small air inlets. The cover is on the back. Now that the cover is removed, you can see the injection nozzles, which spray fuel. The springly flap valves made of thin sheet metal. In the rhythm of the explosions, the flap valves close and open the pipe to let air in again and again for new combustion. The device is ready to go on the launcher. An engine test run is shown. The ignition is switched on. The pressure of the compressed starting air is correct. The space behind the pipe has been cleared. One push of the button. Partial load. Full load. The flap valves are working. The mysterious process of the successive explosions takes place in the pipe. Slow motion recordings. The flap valves close and open in rhythm with the explosions, while the nozzles inject fuel into the combustion chamber. With this engine, the device can cover long distances. Overview of the control systems in the fuselage. Compass, compressed air tank, control unit, rudder machine, elevator machine. The compass sits behind the aluminium fuselage nose. It is built into a hollow sphere made of wood, which protects it from the disturbances caused by sound vibrations of the engine. The compass, whose magnetic system is equipped with pneumatic taps, keeps the missile on course. The compass pulses amplified and attenuated in the control unit. The control unit, a pneumatic gyro control, monitors the horizontal and vertical altitude of the body. It combats gust disturbances faster and more sensitively than the best pilot. Tough development work was necessary until the control unit worked flawlessly, despite the launch blast and the engine vibration. The attitude gyro measures the inclination angle of the flying bomb around the vertical and transversal axis. Contact drive for angle shot. Height box with amplifier piston for height control. The left side, dampening gyro for transverse axis. The right side, dampening gyro for vertical axis. These gyros dampen the spurious rotations of the flying bomb. Here, the pendulum support of the attitude gyro by which an error of migration around the transverse axis is prevented. At the same time, currents controlled by the compass flow in these support pulses, which prevent demigration from the target course. These coils are also used for angle shots. The attitude gyro is a Mott. Running at around 30,000 RPM, in its cardinic suspension, it forms a solid base and allows in this way the measurement of the angle of deviation of the missile from its normal position. Locked like before the launch. After takeoff, the device flies at a fixed climb angle. Upon reaching the normal flight altitude set on the ground, the height regulator shown here has the task to swivel the gyro frame so far that the device gets deflected from the climb into a horizontal flight leading up to the target. The measured values on the position and attenuation gyroscopes are taken with the help of so-called jet pipes. The exiting airflow causes different pressures in the two holes depending on the body position. The ratio of these pressure differences is equal to the rudder deflections. These commands are transmitted from the control unit to the rudder machines through hoses and pipes. Here, the fine steering impulses are converted into powerful rudder movements. The compressed air pressure of 6 atmospheres gives 60 kilograms of adjustment force. The cooperation of the control organs ends in the rudder deflections. And unaffected by any interference, the missile is maintaining its prescribed flight path from start to finish. Special devices are also built into the device to carry out its tasks. Airlog, belly contract, electric detonator, mechanical impact detonator, mechanical long-term detonator, counting unit, descent flaps, and the antenna. While the compass pays attention to keeping the course, the odometer tells when the desired distance has been covered. The log wing prompt screws its way through the air. The revolutions are transmitted electrically by the contactor to the counter, where the distance covered is registered. After 60 kilometers of flight, the counter activates the first contact, arming the electric detonator. This detonator can be triggered by a membrane or tube in contact of the tip of the bow, by a belly landing contact, or by crash/heavy impact. The electrical lines between the odometer, detonator, and compass are all in the top run-through of the cable duct to the control unit and the counter in the rear. If the device lands flat due to any malfunction, the belly land contact triggers the explosive charge. The drives of these two mechanical detonators are released by the ripcord. The one on the left is a mechanical impact detonator. The one on the right is a long-term detonator. This is the counter in action. The 140-meter long antenna is coiled in this tube. Shortly before the destination, the antenna is released electrically by the counter. The disc pulls out the rope/cable in 1 second. The transmitter can radio back the position. Only some of the devices are equipped with a transmitter to check accuracy. The counter works incessantly towards the number 0 in order to switch the descent contact. The underside of the fuselage is smooth in high-speed flight. The descent flaps are folded under the fins until the counter has reached 0 and the descent is triggered. Then, the flaps stand in the airflow. The device plunges down into the target into a steep dive. It can reach speeds of up to 850 kilometers an hour up to the impact. Passage from home to front. The industry delivers separately to home ammunition plants. Fuselage in the delivery condition, load space, surface wings, spar, and accessories. In the Heimatmuna, the parts are subjected to a detailed examination, assembled on a trial basis, and then brought back to the state of supply. In this form of transport, all parts are attached to the fuselage and propulsion pipe in such a way that the device is only a meter wide. On top of the tube, the horizontal stabilizer in a protective box. The sensitive bow tip with protective hood is housed under the tube, between the surfaces attached to the side. By rail transport, the devices dig their way to the front. A wagon can be loaded with 3 devices. First, they come to the Fudmelag, queued munitions/larger field ammunition storage, where storage in large numbers is possible. The Fudmelag serves as an interim storage facility. No work is carried out on the device here. The transport continues by rail to the supply point. Here, the devices are checked for damage, get filled up with fuel, and then get transported via trucks to the collection points. There, the devices are first brought into the pre-assembled state. In this condition, all work and tests are carried out except for surface mounting and setting of the shot/trajectory values. The device can be stored until ready for takeoff command comes. The last job is to bring the device into flight mode. The device is ready to be launched. Fuel and compressed air are filled in. The onboard battery is inserted. All devices are checked. The flight order has also been issued because on the control system, the course and altitude and on the counter, the distance have been set. Starting with the industry that supplies the individual components, the path of the device was followed up to the front. Now, the device is in flight status and is on its way to the launch site. The device is shot in the air with this gun, and then flies on by its own power. The gun or starting ramp length, 48 meters. Departure speed of the device, 370 kilometers per hour. At the end of the pipe, the so-called steam deflector, which deflects the ejecting steam laterally and downwards. The device glides on these surfaces, which are located just above the slotted tube, when it is fired. The control unit with electrical and pneumatic supply lines. The plunger/piston nodes protrudes through its slot in the gun barrel, which attaches or latches on to the underside of the device. The suspension device for the sealing tube with the loops is pushed in. This is the piston that latches onto the device via the piston nose and flings it out. The piston comes out of the muzzle like a bullet and flies in a high arc into the terrain. He will be brought back and reinstated. The opening launcher onto the piston nose, to which the sealing tube slides. The robust steel piston weighs 150 kilos. It is pushed into the pipe without a piston ring or special seals. Loops and pistons are inside. Now, the sealing tube is pushed in. The sealing pipe is 48 meters long, length of the ramp, and has a diameter of 25 millimeters. Its hook-shaped end is attached to the beginning of the gun barrel. A device is used to bring the sealing tube located at the bottom of the gun barrel to the slot. The loops, which are distributed at intervals of 1.5 meters, hold the sealing pipe in its position. The gun barrel is clear. The device can be put on. With this gun feeder cart, the 2.2-ton device is easily placed on top of the gun. The feeder cart is coupled to the gun. After releasing the connection to the undercarriage, the upper carriage with the device is rolled over onto the gun. The gun barrel has an incline of 6 degrees. The device is placed on the gun by means of ingenious or clever spindle drives. Under the fuselage, you can now see the flight fitting on the aircraft descends over the piston nose. The connection between the piston and the aircraft is established. The upper carriage and the feeder carriage are rolled back. Next, the steam generator must be connected. The mobile steam generator unit develops the energies that eject the device with a force of over 40 tons. Propellant and decomposer catalysts are blown in through the showers in the decomposition room or reaction chamber. Compressed air gets filled in. The steam generator is charged by separately filling in propellant and decomposer components, called T and Z stuff. When T and Z components come together, there is a violent buildup of steam. Therefore, be careful when working with these substances. Make sure there are no dirt particles on the T component, otherwise there's a risk of fire. Dirt, gasoline, and T component pose a risk of explosion. Rinse away any overflowing T component immediately with water. Wear protective suit and glasses when working with T and Z components. The steam generator, which was made ready independently of the gun, is now coupled to the gun. The final touches are done. The Device 76 is ready for launch. When deployed, the gun ramp is built as camouflaged as possible. The aircraft and gun ramp are camouflaged to adapt to the terrain. Earth hills and concrete walls should protect the high-quality device from air attacks. In front of us is the ready-to-go gun. How does the startup process take place? The piston is pushed in. The skid lies on the side. The plane descends onto the ramp. At the front, the driver fitting rests on the piston nose. At the rear, the stern rests on the skid. Now, the steam generator comes into the operation. Propellant and decomposer are injected. The sealing tube under the slit is pressed upwards by the steam. The steam expands and propels the piston forward with the aircraft on top. But how does the slot in the launch tube get sealed? The sealing tube slides under the piston nose, then bends upwards and is pressed against the slot behind the piston by steam pressure from below. In a matter of seconds, the aircraft races over the slideway and soars into the air. The piston and skid fall off. With this new launch method, the long-range bomb can be shot in quick succession against a target located far away. It launches in a few minutes. The gun leader sits in the bunker. The start commands come from there. With the command device, the firing process is monitored and triggered by an electric remote control. The launch time is getting closer. The main switch is on. The voltmeter indicates that it works. Now, the 3 warning lamps must light up. They tell the gun operator the device is ready to go. Time is starting to run. 2 more minutes. The compressed air for control and engine is on. The control gyroscopes start up. Faster, ever faster. The last man leaves the launch site. The device is tied up and ready to go. Time is running. 10 seconds to go. Starting pipe engine partial load. Full load. Time is running down. Caution. Launch. Unmanned, self-steering, the long-range bomb moves its way and carries out her mission undetected and unaffected. Now, a launch in slow motion. The piston and skid fall off. The device is climbing. You can see how the control unit keeps forcing the device back on course. The luminous dots were used for experimental purposes. The descent, and now impact on water. The schematic representation shows the trajectory, again from launch to impact. With a departure speed of 370 kilometers an hour, the device leaves the gun and climbs at a trajectory angle of 6 degrees. The redirection or leveling takes place after the target height has been reached, which is adjustable from 300 to 2,000 meters. The device goes into level flight and increases or gains speed. The electric detonator is activated at 60 kilometers. After 10 minutes, the device has reached its maximum speed of over 600 kilometers an hour. The tracking transmitter switches on. Barrier balloons are cut through the cut nose built into the wing. The descent is initiated above the target. The device descends in a dive. An angle shot. If the trajectory of the fixed gun does not coincide with the target, the device is brought onto the new course at an angle. Now, you can see it clearly, or not. The machine curves to the right in the new direction. The process is activated by a mechanical drive and ended after a set time. Then, the further exact course correction is taken over the compass. Now, the schematic representation of the angle shot. The angle firing device enables the changing of direction of 60 degrees, to the left or right of the gun's direction. The curve is initiated after a flight distance of about 15 kilometers. Our model airplane took off. Angular shot/correction starts. It was set at 45 degrees. Now it's on course towards the target. The target is reached. Descent and impact. The device is used to combat area targets. In the middle of the hit grid, the impacts give a picture accuracy which corresponds to the requirements of the mission. And now, some more shots of the launch and the flight of the SZG-76 device.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks' Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth, and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.